Welcome to Historical Bedtime Stories, where the echoes of the past are told in calm voices to soothe the present. Tonight, settle in as we drift through the quiet story of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. The American Civil War was not just a conflict of armies. It was a war of families, ideologies, and moral reckoning. Brother fought brother. The nation, once united by common cause, fractured into two bleeding halves. At the center of it all stood Abraham Lincoln, a man not bred for war, not thirsty for power, but thrust into history's furnace. He was not a general. He didn't wear a sword, but through words, through decisions, through tireless resolve, he led a divided country through its darkest hours. The war would test him as deeply as it tested the nation. He wasn't always sure. He made mistakes, he hesitated, he suffered, but he endured. The Civil War would not only define the future of the United States, it would define Lincoln himself. This is the story of how he walked through fire with quiet courage and emerged as something far greater than he began. Before he was president, before the White House and the war, Abraham Lincoln was a man of humble roots. Born in a Kentucky log cabin in 1809, he grew up working hard labor with little formal education. But he read voraciously. He taught himself law, spoke with clarity, and earned respect as an honest, thoughtful lawyer. In the 1840s, he served a single term in Congress. Then he stepped away from politics, watching from the quiet of Springfield. But the country changed, and so did he. The spread of slavery, especially into new Western territories, troubled him deeply. He re-entered public life, not as an abolitionist, but as someone who believed slavery must not grow. The debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858 brought his words to national attention. He lost that Senate race, but gained a voice. He did not seek war, but he would not let the Union fall to pieces. To Abraham Lincoln, the Union was more than geography. It was a sacred idea. A government by the people for the people had never lasted this long. But by the 1850s, slavery sat like a spark in dry tinder. Lincoln wasn't initially calling for abolition. His focus was on preserving the Union, believing the Constitution could hold even opposing systems together. But he also saw slavery as deeply wrong. He hoped it would fade. Southern leaders, however, saw his resistance to slavery's expansion as a threat to their way of life. The more he spoke, the clearer it became. There could be no compromise that satisfied both freedom and bondage. Though he walked carefully at first, trying to hold North and South in dialogue, events soon swept past compromise. Slavery wasn't just a political issue, it was the dividing line. Lincoln would come to see that preserving the Union meant confronting its soul. The election of 1860 was unlike any other. The nation stood on the edge of division, and four candidates split the vote. Abraham Lincoln ran as a Republican with a platform that opposed the expansion of slavery. He didn't even appear on the ballot in many southern states, yet he won with a clear electoral majority. His calm demeanor, sharp mind, and moral firmness made him a compelling figure to many in the North. But to the South, his victory was terrifying. They saw in Lincoln a man who, though not calling for immediate abolition, would halt slavery's growth, and that, they believed, was the beginning of its end. They feared being outvoted forever. The fragile union of states had cracked. Lincoln didn't celebrate loudly. He felt the weight. He knew trouble was coming. As the results settled, he waited in Springfield, quiet but resolute, as the storm clouds gathered. The storm began before Lincoln even arrived in Washington. South Carolina acted first, seceding from the Union in December 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. By February 1861, 7 states had declared they no longer belonged to the United States. They formed a new government, the Confederate States of America. Their message was clear. Lincoln's presidency was unacceptable. Secession wasn't a mere protest. It was rebellion. And yet, as these states left, Lincoln had no official power to stop them. He hadn't been inaugurated yet. In Springfield, he watched with quiet urgency. He believed secession was illegal, yet he also wanted to avoid war. Could reason pull them back? Could compromise hold? As he prepared to leave Illinois, Lincoln understood that the country he had been elected to lead was already unraveling. The Union was breaking before his eyes, and soon it would fall to him to decide its fate. March 4th, 1861. Abraham Lincoln stood on the steps of the Capitol, facing a divided nation. His face was solemn, voice calm. Soldiers were everywhere, guarding against possible attack. He spoke not with thunder, but with quiet conviction. He called for unity, not vengeance. "We are not enemies," he said. "We must not be enemies." He appealed to history, to shared bonds, and most famously, to the better angels of our nature. He did not threaten war, but he would not accept disunion. Secession, he declared, was void. The government would hold its property and carry out its duties, but would not strike first. It was a careful balance, a final call for peace. He hoped the southern states would reconsider. But many had already chosen their course. Lincoln's first day as president was not one of celebration. It was a quiet beginning under looming shadows. The clock toward war had started ticking. April 1861. A spark lit the dry field. Fort Sumter, a federal garrison in Charleston Harbor, was under threat. The Confederates demanded its surrender. Lincoln faced a hard choice: abandon the fort and appear weak, or resupply it and risk war. He chose to send provisions, no weapons, just food. The Confederates, unmoved, opened fire on April 12th. The fort fell after 34 hours. No lives were lost in the battle, but the nation was now at war. Lincoln responded swiftly. He called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. The response was electric. Some cheered, others seethed. More southern states, including Virginia, joined the Confederacy. The line was drawn. What had been political tension turned to open conflict. Lincoln didn't rush into aggression, but he wouldn't stand aside. The Union had been attacked. The Civil War had begun, not with a massive battle, but with cannon smoke over a harbor and a president's resolve. In the early days of the Civil War, Lincoln faced a perilous puzzle: how to keep the border states, slaveholding but still in the Union, loyal. Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware were strategically vital. If they seceded, Washington, D.C. would be surrounded. But they were fragile, torn between Union and Confederacy. Lincoln walked a narrow line. He could not call for immediate emancipation. It would push them away. He suspended habeas corpus in Maryland, arrested suspected secessionists, and carefully managed public sentiment. He understood these states weren't won by speeches alone. They needed firm but sensitive handling. His caution frustrated abolitionists, but Lincoln knew timing mattered. Keeping the Union together was his first priority. Without the border states, the North's chances of victory would dwindle. Each decision was a calculation. Push too hard and they'd leave. Do too little and rebellion would spread. Lincoln balanced principle with pragmatism, preserving the whole one fragile piece at a time. In the first months of the war, the Union was unprepared. There was no large standing army, no organized command. Volunteers flooded in, full of spirit but lacking discipline. Lincoln moved quickly. He authorized new regiments, managed supplies, and with his cabinet began appointing generals, each with regional loyalties and political strings. It was not easy. Some commanders were chosen more for popularity than skill. Rivalries flared. State governors demanded influence. The machinery of war was rusty, and Lincoln had to oil it while it groaned into motion. He studied maps, read military texts, and visited troops. He wasn't a soldier, but he learned quickly. He knew the stakes. A divided, confused army couldn't win a war. His desk became a command post. Every promotion, every decision had consequences. Lincoln built not just an army of men, but a structure of leadership that could carry the Union through years of bloody conflict ahead. Among Lincoln's earliest challenges was General George B. McClellan, a talented young officer with a gift for organizing. He took command of the Army of the Potomac in 1861 and quickly restored order and morale. Soldiers adored him. Newspapers praised him. He was hailed as a savior. But Lincoln soon discovered McClellan's flaw: caution. He delayed, always asking for more men, more time. He overestimated enemy strength and avoided risk. Lincoln, frustrated, urged him forward, but McClellan hesitated. The two men respected each other, yet clashed in style. Lincoln needed boldness. McClellan preferred perfection. In letters, McClellan sometimes spoke arrogantly, even dismissively of his president. Still, Lincoln tolerated him longer than many expected, hoping his promise would bear fruit. But each delay cost time and lives. Lincoln saw that the war would not be won by preparation alone. It would take action, and eventually, patience would give way to the need for change. As the war dragged on, voices in the North grew louder, urging Lincoln to take a bolder stand against slavery. Radical Republicans pushed for immediate emancipation. They saw the war not only as a fight for the Union, but as a moral crusade. Lincoln, however, moved cautiously. He understood the risk. If he acted too soon, the fragile loyalty of border states might shatter. Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland were vital to the Union cause, and they still permitted slavery. Lincoln didn't want to turn them against him. He believed timing was crucial. He wanted the people and the army ready for such a step. Yet, as casualties mounted and the war deepened, Lincoln's own views evolved. Emancipation began to look not just like a moral necessity, but a strategic one. Slavery fueled the Southern war machine. Ending it, he realized, could strike at the Confederacy's heart and redefine the nation's future forever. By 1862, the war had spread across thousands of miles. Battles raged in Virginia, Tennessee, and the Mississippi Valley. The scale of violence stunned the nation. Young soldiers, once full of fire, returned home broken. If they returned at all. Lincoln was not a distant president. He visited army camps, hospitals, and spoke to the wounded directly. These visits changed him. The grief in soldiers' eyes, the moans of pain, the letters never delivered, all left deep marks. He felt the burden more than most. The war wasn't abstract to him. It was blood, faces, names. As generals shifted, strategies faltered, and cities burned, Lincoln remained steady. His compassion grew even as the war hardened him. The scope of suffering was immense, and yet he pressed forward, knowing retreat meant failure. The war had become total. It touched every home, every heart. And Lincoln, more than anyone, carried that sorrow with him every day. Lincoln was not a military man by training, but as commander-in-chief, he grew into a strategist. He studied battle reports, examined maps late into the night, and corresponded directly with his generals. Some found his questions tiresome, but Lincoln asked them anyway. He wanted to understand the terrain, the troop movements, the risks. Unlike many presidents before him, Lincoln immersed himself in military decisions. He didn't want to micromanage, but he refused to be passive. When generals hesitated, he nudged. When they failed, he replaced them. His mind worked methodically, weighing each action's impact not just on the battlefield, but on the nation. He came to see the big picture, the political, military, and moral elements tied together. War wasn't just about winning ground. It was about sustaining support, maintaining purpose, and slowly wearing down an enemy that wouldn't quit. Lincoln, through necessity and will, became a wartime leader in every sense. September 17, 1862. Near the small town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, Union and Confederate forces clashed in what would become the bloodiest single day in American history. Over 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing by nightfall. The Battle of Antietam was tactically inconclusive, but it halted General Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North. Lincoln had been waiting for such a moment. He needed a Union success to announce a bold new policy, emancipation. Though General McClellan failed to pursue Lee afterward, Lincoln seized the opportunity. He called it a victory and prepared to reshape the war's meaning. Antietam was brutal, a muddy field soaked with blood. The images shocked the public. Yet it gave Lincoln what he needed, the chance to act not just as a wartime president, but as a moral leader. He understood now this war wasn't only about unity, it was about freedom, and timing was everything. On January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were free. It did not free slaves in border states or in areas already under Union control. Yet it transformed the war. What had begun as a fight to preserve the Union was now also a fight for human freedom. Lincoln believed the Constitution gave him this war power as commander-in-chief, and he used it. The proclamation was both a moral act and a military strategy. It encouraged enslaved people to flee or resist, weakening the Southern economy. It allowed black men to enlist in the Union Army, adding vital manpower. It also changed global opinion. Nations like Britain, who had considered recognizing the Confederacy, now hesitated. Lincoln knew the document was limited in scope, but it was a beginning. The moral ground of the war had shifted. There would be no turning back. The Emancipation Proclamation reshaped the North, but not without division. Some citizens cheered. Abolitionists celebrated a dream finally being realized. Black communities wept and sang in churches. Others, however, were outraged. In cities like New York, fear of job competition led to riots. Draft resistance grew. Racism didn't disappear with a signature. Lincoln was called reckless by critics, a tyrant by opponents. Copperhead Democrats warned that the proclamation would prolong the war and divide the North. Newspapers published fierce debates. Some Union soldiers resented fighting for a cause they hadn't signed up for. But Lincoln stood firm. He knew the decision was right, even if not popular. He hoped history would judge him not by immediate applause, but by the future he tried to shape. Emancipation didn't end slavery immediately, but it declared, for the first time, that freedom was a Union goal. That changed the meaning of every battle to come. The Emancipation Proclamation not only declared freedom, it opened the Union Army to black soldiers. Thousands of African American men, many of them formerly enslaved, answered the call. They fought with courage, facing brutal conditions and unequal pay. Lincoln watched their sacrifice with deep admiration. At first, there was resistance within the Army ranks. Some white officers doubted black soldiers' effectiveness, but at places like Fort Wagner, they proved their valor. Lincoln began to speak publicly of their contributions, praising their dedication and skill. These men weren't just fighting for a country, they were fighting for their own freedom and the freedom of their families. Their presence changed the Army and the war. By the end, nearly 200,000 black soldiers had served. Lincoln came to believe that without them, victory might not be possible. He saw them not as tools of policy, but as brothers in arms, equals in sacrifice, courage, and hope. July 1863, the war's tide turned at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. For 3 days, Union and Confederate forces collided in fields and hills soaked with blood. General Robert E. Lee had hoped to win a decisive victory on Northern soil, perhaps even force peace. But Union forces under General George Meade held firm. On the third day, Pickett's charge, a desperate Confederate assault, was repelled with devastating losses. Over 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. Lincoln waited anxiously for news. When word arrived, it was clear. The Union had won. The Confederate momentum had stalled, yet Lincoln, always mindful of the cost, did not celebrate loudly. Gettysburg was a turning point, but also a graveyard. Lincoln prepared to visit the battlefield for a ceremony honoring the dead. There he would speak only briefly, but his words would echo far beyond the hills of Pennsylvania. Gettysburg marked not just a battle's end, but a nation's turning. November 19, 1863. Amid wind and solemn crowds, Abraham Lincoln stood at Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for Union soldiers who had fallen there. He spoke for just 2 minutes, yet in that short time, he reframed the entire war. The Gettysburg Address was not just a speech, it was a statement of purpose. He began with history. 77 years ago, he reminded the audience of the nation's founding ideals. Then, with quiet power, he declared that the war was a test, not just of unity, but of democracy itself. Could a nation conceived in liberty endure? He honored the dead, not with grandeur, but with humility. He said the living must dedicate themselves to a new birth of freedom, that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, must not perish. The speech was brief, but it became timeless, Lincoln's clearest vision of what the war truly meant. By late 1863, not all voices in the North supported Lincoln. A group of anti-war Democrats, known as Copperheads, accused him of destroying civil liberties. They called him a dictator, mocking him in newspapers and political cartoons. Some were simply tired of war. Others sympathized with the South. In response to internal threats, Lincoln took controversial steps. He suspended habeas corpus in certain areas, allowing arrests without immediate trial. Critics howled. Supporters defended him. He believed the measures were temporary necessities. But the pressure mounted. The draft, the casualties, the taxes, it all fed into public unrest. Some even called for negotiations with the Confederacy. But Lincoln stayed his course. He welcomed criticism, even jokes at his expense, but he would not compromise on union or freedom. The weight of leadership grew heavier by the day. Yet through insults and anger, Lincoln stood firm, eyes fixed on victory and the nation still worth saving. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln faced a volatile home front. Dissent surged, especially in border states and Democratic strongholds. In 1861, he made the controversial decision to suspend habeas corpus, allowing the government to arrest and detain individuals without immediate trial. Critics claimed it was unconstitutional, a step toward tyranny, but Lincoln argued the Constitution allowed such measures during rebellion. He believed the Union's survival outweighed strict legal norms. Rail lines were sabotaged, soldiers were attacked, pro-Confederate newspapers incited unrest. Lincoln saw these not as isolated issues, but as threats to national survival. Arrests were made, editors jailed, and some legislators detained. The courts pushed back, but Lincoln held firm. He didn't enjoy these actions, they burdened him. But he believed civil liberties meant little if the Union ceased to exist. To save the Constitution, he sometimes had to bend it. The war demanded sacrifice, and not all of it came on battlefields. By 1864, the war had dragged on for 3 brutal years. Bodies piled up, and victory remained elusive. The North grew weary. Lincoln, battered by criticism and war fatigue, feared he would lose re-election. His opponent would likely seek peace, perhaps even with the Confederacy still intact. Lincoln prepared a quiet letter, vowing to cooperate with his successor to save the Union before leaving office. He knew the stakes. A defeat in November could unravel everything. Public opinion wavered. Draft riots, inflation, and battlefield losses had sapped morale. Even within his own party, discontent simmered. Some Republicans wanted a different candidate. Lincoln stayed the course, focused on his duty. He didn't campaign in the traditional sense, trusting that events, if they shifted, might speak for him. He believed in democracy, even if it cost him the presidency. As summer turned to fall, the future of the nation seemed as uncertain as ever. To broaden his appeal and solidify national unity, Lincoln made a bold political choice in 1864. He dropped his vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, a Maine Republican, and selected Andrew Johnson, a Democrat from Tennessee. Johnson was a Southerner who had remained loyal to the Union, even when his home state seceded. The idea was to form a national Union ticket, a symbol of cross-party commitment to victory. Some Republicans balked. Johnson was rough-edged, combative, and unpredictable. But Lincoln valued the message his choice sent. The Union was worth preserving, and loyal Americans existed on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. It was a risky move. Johnson wasn't a traditional running mate, but Lincoln was thinking beyond convention. He wanted to show that this war was about reconciliation as well as victory. Johnson, for all his flaws, represented Southern loyalty. If the North and South were to heal, such bridges had to begin somewhere. In the fall of 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta, a key Confederate stronghold. The victory electrified the North. Sherman didn't stop there. He launched his infamous March to the Sea, cutting through Georgia and devastating Confederate infrastructure. His strategy was total war. Railroads torn up, crops burned, cities stripped of supplies. The goal was not just military conquest, but psychological warfare, breaking the South's will to continue. For Lincoln, Sherman's success was a godsend. Before Atlanta's fall, Lincoln's re-election chances were bleak. Now, public opinion shifted. People saw a path to victory. Morale surged. Sherman became a hero in the North, a villain in the South. Lincoln understood that harsh measures would shorten the war and ultimately save lives. He supported Sherman's campaign fully. The victories reinvigorated the Union cause. Lincoln, once preparing for electoral defeat, now saw a chance to finish what he had started. Union restored, slavery destroyed. On November 8, 1864, the American people voted, and they chose Abraham Lincoln. Despite war fatigue, criticism, and deep divisions, he won handily against Democratic challenger George B. McClellan. It was a remarkable political victory. No president had won re-election during a civil war before. The results were clear. The North wanted to finish the fight. Soldiers voted overwhelmingly for Lincoln, affirming his leadership. He saw the outcome not as a personal triumph, but as a mandate for justice and perseverance. The people had chosen war to end war. Lincoln now had the political capital to pursue total victory and begin shaping peace. He would push harder against slavery, support Reconstruction planning, and ensure no compromise undermined the cause. Lincoln celebrated quietly, aware of the immense work still ahead. The Union's survival was not yet secure. but the people had given him time and trust to see the war through to its conclusion. March 4th, 1865. On the steps of the Capitol, Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office for a second time. The war was nearly won, yet his words were not triumphant. They were somber, reflective, even poetic. He spoke of slavery's role in the war's origins and the shared guilt of both North and South. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he said, America must heal. Lincoln rejected revenge. He sought reconciliation, justice, and mercy. His address was brief but profound. In just over 700 words, he called for a nation torn apart to bind its wounds and move forward together. He did not gloat. He did not scold. He appealed to higher ideals, justice, forgiveness, and unity. The crowd listened in silence. Some wept. Lincoln's vision for peace was not built on punishment, but on understanding. It was a roadmap for healing, if the country would only follow it. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The Confederate cause was finished. There were still scattered fighting and commanders yet to yield, but the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Lincoln received the news with quiet relief. He did not celebrate loudly, nor did he demand vengeance. Instead, he urged Grant to offer generous terms. Confederate soldiers were allowed to return home with their horses and dignity intact. Lincoln wanted no grand victory parade, just peace. He believed that if reconciliation was to succeed, it must begin immediately. No mass executions, no humiliation, just a chance to rebuild. He had guided the nation through its darkest trial, but he knew the road ahead would be long. As the guns fell silent at Appomattox, Lincoln saw not an ending, but the beginning of the next great challenge, reunifying the nation. With the war nearly over, Lincoln turned his attention toward healing the shattered country. His vision for Reconstruction was lenient and forward-looking. He wanted to welcome the Southern states back quickly, without hatred or harsh punishment. Let us bind up the nation's wounds, he said. His plan called for loyalty oaths and the establishment of loyal governments. He supported the 13th Amendment, ensuring slavery's end. But above all, he believed in reconciliation. Some in Congress, known as radical Republicans, wanted to punish the South more severely and enforce civil rights with federal authority. Lincoln sought balance. He feared prolonged occupation and bitterness would only reignite division. He dreamed of a united country, healed not just on paper, but in spirit. He knew rebuilding trust would take time and patience, but he had led the Union through war. He believed he could also lead it through peace. Sadly, time would not permit it. On the night of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. It was meant to be a relaxing evening. Instead, it became a national tragedy. John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer, slipped into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. The assassin leapt to the stage and escaped. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house where he died the next morning. The nation was stunned. Grief swept across the land. Bells tolled. People wept openly in the streets. Booth had hoped to revive the Confederate cause. Instead, he martyred Lincoln. The president who had sought peace and unity was killed just as victory arrived. His death shocked both North and South. In one final cruel irony, Lincoln paid for peace with his life. The healing he envisioned would begin with in death. In death, Abraham Lincoln became more than a man. He became a symbol, a martyr for union, freedom, and democracy. His assassination elevated him to near sainthood in the public memory. Mourners lined miles of railroad tracks as his funeral train traveled from Washington to Springfield. Eulogies painted him as savior, prophet, and redeemer. But Lincoln's legacy is deeper than legend. He preserved the Union when it could have splintered forever. He ended slavery in its legal form. He expanded the meaning of American democracy and gave it moral weight. His words, the Gettysburg Address, the second inaugural, redefined what the United States could be. He was not perfect, and he wrestled with doubt, failure, and criticism. Yet through it all, he remained humble, honest, and resolute. Lincoln left behind not just a changed country, but a changed ideal of leadership. In the darkest hour, he held the nation together. That is his enduring gift. You've been listening to Historical Bedtime Stories. gentle reflections from history to ease the night. Sleep well and let the past watch over your dreams. Until next time, good night.